Hey, in this lesson, we're going to be looking at HTML tables, and the table element represents tabular data. That is, it's information. It's represented in a two-dimensional table comprised of rows and columns, and each one of the cells that's contained in there contains information and data and other HTML code. So let's first start by constructing a table. And you can also think of a table as a two-dimensional chart. And a table is defined with a table tag. And then within each table, you can have a number of rows. So these are indicated with the TR. And then each cell or each table data unit is represented with the TD. So let's do a quick refresh. So there's our first basic table. And then you can have as many columns as you want, so many table data cells as you want. And then also as many rows as you want as well. So adding in additional rows, I can just simply copy paste it, and we're constructing our table. There's also the table header, which is defined by TH. So usually that's near the top. So this is the table header tag. And this is also contained within a table row. So wrap the table headers within the table row. And this one's going to have two columns. So maybe it can be counter 1 and counter 2. That we just have the 1 and the 2 in each one of the columns. So let's refresh. And the table heading by default, it gets more of a bold styling applied to it. And each one of these table elements can contain any type of HTML. So you could also have images in them and a whole bunch of HTML. So it depends on what data that you want to represent there. And I'm just copying and pasting some of the HTML from before into the table. And that's how it just gets displayed within the table. And what happens is the other cells will adjust. So this cell adjusted to be the same height, and it's automatically positioned in the content of the center. In order to add table border, so typically this is done with styling. And we'll just add the style attribute, and border is just indicated with the border property. And there's a short format for border property. So it's expecting 3 parameters there, which is the width, the border style, and then the color. So once we add that and we refresh, that's going to give a border around that property. And you can add it also around each one of the elements, so along the rows and as well as the cells if you want. And additional styling as well is applied with the styling attribute. There's also one for border spacing, which is commonly used in tables. So this is just a pix width, and it will allocate a little bit more spacing for each one of the border styles. You might also encounter in some cases that if you've got a number of rows and you might have several cells that are spanning the one row. Let me add in another row here at the end, and I'll just call it end column. And if I refresh, and we're missing data within these cells here because we've only got the 2 columns of data. I'll make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. And if I add in on this cell, and if I add in on the bottom row, but I leave the middle one still with only 2, but we want this content to span 2 of the data cells, so across 2 columns. So let's select that element, and that's the one that's right here. So we've got 1, 2, whereas the rest of them have 3, and you can account for call span using the call span attribute, and then you just need to indicate how many columns it's spanning. So when you refresh, now it's going to be spanning that entire width. And I'll quickly just add in a border color so that we can see what this element is spanning. So now that cell will have a border and it's spanning across both columns. You can also span across multiple rows if you want. So let's do one more time, and we'll copy and paste across multiple rows. And let's say, for instance, instead of having this one, because this one is going to have the 3 cells, and we want this one to be multiple rows. Do another refresh. So we want this one to be multiple rows. So let's add in the border styling so that we can see this cell. And we want to span the 2 rows. So let's add in the property. And the property to span multiple rows is row span. And then you just specify how many rows you want to span. Now we refresh it and we're spanning the 2 rows. Here we're spanning the 2 columns. And you can add in the calculations as needed to span across different rows, different columns, merging the cells together effectively. And before constructing a table, you should plan out how many rows, how many columns, and this can be driven by the data that's going to be contained within the table. So plan it out first before you construct the table. When we create tables, and with modern website design, we do it with styling. So we update the table way and look and feel of the table by applying style content to it. So you can do that with the style tag at the top, and then selecting the table element and applying this different styling properties. In this case, we're copying pasting the border. So this is going to do the same thing that we saw with the style attribute, but it's bringing it out of the HTML code, which is going to make it more easy to update if needed and to visually see when we are looking at the code within the HTML where the styling has been applied. And then in addition, you can copy, separate out the different elements that are going to get the styling. So a comma TD will style the border property across all of the table data cells. And there really is a lot you can do with styling, but I just want to introduce the basics of styling because it's important when it comes to tables, and it often gets applied to tables. So the best format is usually to apply it within a separate styling tag element instead of doing it in line, because as it's easier to read and select and update the border styling. So if all of a sudden you wanted to have red styling, you could easily update the color within the style tagging. You don't have to go into your HTML code and figure out which cell it is that you want to access and apply styling to. And for even more table structure, there's the table head, table body, and table foot. So these are indicated with T-head tags, T-body tags, and T-foot tags. So the T-head groups the header content in the table, T-body groups the body content in the table, and T-foot groups the footer content within the bottom of the table. So going into the table structure, I'm going to add in the T-head, which is going to group all of the content that is designed to be sitting within the head section, and then close that off. And just as we did with the main HTML tags, next we've got a T-body area, and this is where the core body goes. And they might also have, lastly, a T-foot, and then another table row. And this one can be col span all the way across. And we did have 3 columns. So you can do double or single quotes. And then we'll just write footer at the bottom. So let's refresh. And now we've got the footer sitting there at the bottom. So we added in the table foot. So now it's your turn. Go ahead and construct a simple table. Make sure that you've got a bunch of columns and rows. Also try updating the col span as well as the row span, so across multiple rows, across multiple columns. And then try the style tag by selecting the table and the table cells and applying a border to them. And you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson.